Something extraordinary is happening in the courts right now, and it's not coming from the prosecutors. For the first time, a federal judge is forcing Melania Trump to testify under oath, sending shockwaves through Donald Trump's legal team, quietly unraveling a strategy they thought was ironclad, exposing vulnerabilities they've desperately tried to shield at any cost. Court rulings, sworn depositions, and behind-the-scenes frenzy are colliding as the judiciary draws a line. This isn't just another legal skirmish or a fleeting scandal. It's a test of whether American justice is ruled by law or by one family's instincts. Stay until the end, because what's unfolding here could reshape how accountability works in the United States long after the verdicts fade. So imagine this moment late at night in Manhattan, phones lighting up across law firms, associates whispering, attorneys checking their inboxes twice to make sure what they're reading is real, because the former First Lady and current one in Trump's second term is furious, not at Democrats, not at the media, but at the fallout from her own legal maneuver. And for the first time in a long time, the unraveling isn't coming from external accusers outside the courtroom. It's coming from inside the filings. And that's where the real peril always begins, because right now a judge's confirmation is compelling Melania Trump to testify under oath. And no, this isn't just the usual tabloid fodder or anonymous tips meant to rattle supporters. This is something deeper, colder, and far more consequential, because it cuts directly into the one thing the Trumps believe they cannot live without: impenetrable privacy. And the reason this ruling matters is not just that some critics feel vindicated over lingering questions, whether it's the claims in Michael Wolff's book or the soaring scrutiny of family finances or the lingering unanswered ties that never seem to dissolve. It's that federal judges themselves are beginning to openly mandate disclosures from the very figures the Trumps are desperate to protect. And when that happens, when the safeguards inside the system start to erode, defendants don't respond calmly, they escalate, they dramatize, they appeal frantically. And that's exactly what we're watching unfold right now. A legal defense leaning hard into motions and crisis language to shield itself from internal missteps. Because at the heart of this entire ordeal is a simple but terrifying reality that even seasoned legal veterans are struggling to process out loud. The former First Lady of the United States has been publicly compelled to submit to a deposition in ways that could drag the Trump family into revelations not with some distant litigant, but with their own past. And when legal analysts laid this out in blunt terms, it landed like a shockwave. Because once you strip away the headlines and the spin, what you're left with is a scenario that sounds absurd until you remember we've stopped being allowed to dismiss these filings as bluffs. Because residency is not a blank line on a form, it is tied to jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a federal threshold. And federal threshold's core principle is diversity of citizenship, meaning that any deposition on that front isn't just symbolic. It's a legal and personal nightmare that theoretically places the Trumps in direct exposure to questions about marriage, taxes, and Epstein connections. And the fact that attorneys are now having to seriously explain this to the public is itself a sign of how unmoored the conversation has become, because no one in America voted for a presidency that risks family depositions over defamation rhetoric. And yet here we are parsing rulings, weighing implications, and watching Trump's legal team quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it's forced open. And this is where Melania's strategy becomes critical to understanding the backlash, because she doesn't process lawsuits as alliances or settlements or shared legal obligations. She processes them like leverage, like a deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. And that mindset might work in a negotiation, but in federal court, it gets secrets spilled. And Trump's attorneys know this. They understand that once a judge frames deposition as mandatory, the machinery starts moving whether the defense likes it or not, which is why the removal to federal court suddenly became the battlefield, not as an abstract procedural debate, but as an emergency trap. And when that trap was sprung, when the judge confirmed the need for sworn testimony, the Trumps didn't respond with negotiation or persuasion. They responded with panic, appeals, and threats, because that's what happens when someone who believes privacy is absolute realizes it's actually conditional. And the reported scramble in Trump's legal circles wasn't just about one deposition. It was about the shock of discovering that strategy has limits, that even in their own filings, there are lines that can't be crossed without consequences. And for Trump, that consequence feels existential, because his entire post-election narrative hinges on projecting invincibility, inevitability, and control. And nothing undermines that faster than a family member publicly compelled to answer under oath, especially when the issue at stake is jurisdiction, credibility, and constitutional boundaries. And this is where the narrative accelerates, because faced with confirmation, the Trumps don't retreat. They reframe. They reach for the language of overreach, declaring extraordinary appeals not just as legal tools, but as political weapons. And the motion to dismiss tied to jurisdictional assets fits perfectly into this pattern because it allows them to cast themselves as the sole victims of judicial bias while portraying dissenting rulings as obstacles. Even though the underlying reality is far more complicated, involving long timelines, massive personal interests, uncertain disclosures, and revelations that would flow primarily to public scrutiny rather than private resolution. But complexity has never been the point. The point is dominance, distraction, and control of the narrative. Because rulings change the rules. Rulings centralize attention, and rulings shift focus away from uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why long-promised immunities have faltered, why document protections have been pierced, and why it took judicial pressure rather than voluntary compliance to move certain oversight actions forward. And when experts like legal commentators start talking openly about compliance failures and unanswered affidavits, it signals something important, not a conclusion, not an accusation, but concern that process itself has broken down. And that concern is exactly what the Trumps cannot afford, because their political survival depends not just on winning arguments, but on exhausting the opposition, flooding the zone, and keeping every controversy competing for oxygen. And that's why these threads, judicial confirmation, deposition mandates, legal panic, and stalled appeals, aren't separate stories. And they're the same story viewed from different angles. A family trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos. And attorneys who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of miscalculation, weighing institutional damage against client loyalty, and realizing that if they don't act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because once a defendant openly suggests they are guided only by their own judgment and not by law, precedents, or oaths, the question stops being personal and becomes structural. And that's the moment we're in. A moment where behind closed doors, Trump's legal team is asking themselves whether blocking this is an act of defense or an act of preservation. Because history doesn't remember who argued the loudest. It remembers who stepped in when the rules were bending past their breaking point. And this confirmation, quiet in some places, explosive in others, may be the first real sign that the internal safeguards are finally being tested, not by the opposition, but by those who know exactly how dangerous unchecked exposure can become when it's wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and the language of permanent crisis. And as this legal unraveling deepens, the real story shifts from what the judge is ruling publicly to what Trump's team is doing privately. Because behind the filings, behind the social media outrage and the carefully worded statements, there is a growing recognition among defense counsel that they are no longer dealing with a conventional lawsuit, but with a client who sees every judicial limit as a personal insult. And that realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. Because when the deposition order advanced with judicial confirmation, it wasn't an accident or a momentary lapse in strategy. It was a calculated consequence of attorneys who understand that once the defense normalizes federal removal, the court becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. And that fear is not ideological. It's procedural because diversity jurisdiction exists precisely for moments like this. Moments when a litigant's instincts outrun the system's safeguards. And the fact that the Trumps reacted with panic, appeals, and threats of political destruction only reinforces the concern that their decision-making process is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and legacy obsession. And legacy is a critical word here because Trump's fixation on being remembered, on being seen as dominant, transformative, and historically consequential, has increasingly collided with the reality that his protections have not translated into immunity, prosperity, or restraint. And when the myth of untouchability collapses under the weight of deposition rhetoric, even loyal defenders begin to fracture. Because testimonies are not abstractions to voters. They are costs, risks, and consequences. And attorneys up for reevaluation understand that no amount of branding can sell family exposure as a victory, which is why the turn toward emergency appeals feels less like leadership and more like panic. Because appeals allow them to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and recast opposition as sabotage. And this tactic has a long history, not just in American litigation, but globally, where figures who feel their authority slipping reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the legal moment in their favor. And in the Trump's case, the jurisdictional emergency is a textbook example of how personal claims are framed as legal imperatives, even when the practical benefits are distant, uncertain, and largely protective. Because the language of overreach is not about timelines or feasibility, it's about optics, control, and narrative dominance. And while the defense insists this move is about about protecting interests, experts on both sides see something else, a strategic distraction designed to shift attention away from courtroom oversight, internal legal dissent, and growing scrutiny of family follow-through. And this is where Trump's relationship with his own team becomes increasingly adversarial because he doesn't just want support, he demands submission. And when attorneys assert independence, he treats it as betrayal rather than governance, publicly threatening their careers while privately depending on their motions for case confirmations, legislative priorities, and institutional cover. And that contradiction exposes the fragility of his position, because power that relies on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. And we're watching that process unfold in real time as defense counsel quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide when and how to draw lines that were once unthinkable to draw. And this internal calculation is fueled by a broader concern that the Trump's rhetoric about law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic but operational. Because when a litigant suggests they are governed by personal judgment rather than federal rules or constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview in which rules exist only when convenient. And that worldview terrifies attorneys who understand that precedent outlives cases. Because if these norms collapse now, they won't magically reappear later. And this anxiety has turned routine motions into flashpoints, phone calls into confrontations, and procedural disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. And all of this is happening against a backdrop of mounting public confusion and fatigue, where observers struggle to separate spectacle from substance. And that confusion is not accidental. It's strategic because a crowded information environment benefits those who thrive on chaos. And Trump has always understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountability, which is why the convergence of these stories matters so much, because the deposition fight, the jurisdictional ruling, the legal panic, and the stalled appeals are not isolated controversies. They are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. And attorneys who once rationalized every action as temporary or tactical are now confronting the possibility that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction itself becomes a form of consent. And that realization has changed the tone inside the team from loyalty to triage, because they are no longer asking how to help Trump win the next cycle. They are asking how to prevent irreversible damage to the institutions they still need to function after he is gone. And that shift, subtle but profound, is why this confirmation feels different, quieter in some ways, but far more serious, because it's driven not by ideology, but by alarm, by counsel who understand that when deposition powers become routine and exposure rhetoric becomes casual, the line between litigation and unraveling blurs. And once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without a cost. And that cost is what the legal team is now trying, perhaps belatedly, to avoid, even as Trump escalates attacks and frames every check on his privacy as an attack on the family itself. Because in his mind, the two are inseparable. And that belief, more than any single ruling or controversy, is what has finally pushed members of his own circle into open resistance, setting the stage for an internal confrontation that will define not just this case, but the future balance of accountability long after the headlines fade. And while the public argument rages over depositions and jurisdictional declarations, a quieter, more unsettling pressure is building beneath the surface, because every time the defense escalates the language of crisis, it inadvertently shines a light on what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, and the slow, methodical work of accountability. And this is where the story takes a darker, more procedural turn, not into conspiracy or rumor, but into the uncomfortable territory of process failures and unanswered questions. Because when experts begin asking why promised dismissals are delayed, why reviews stretch on indefinitely, and why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they aren't alleging conclusions. They're identifying red flags. And red flags are dangerous not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing a defense built on speed, spectacle, and dominance struggles to manage. And that's why the discussion around compelled testimonies has become so sensitive, because the litigants themselves elevated these protections into a defining strategy, signaling urgency, prioritization, and invulnerability, only for reality to unfold far more slowly than rhetoric suggested. And when commentators like those analyzing Wolf's claims begin publicly describing the gap between expectation and execution, emphasizing affidavits, timelines, and compliance requirements rather than theories, it reframes the issue entirely, turning it from a political talking point into an administrative credibility test. And that shift matters because credibility is the currency of defense. And once it's questioned, every subsequent explanation faces higher skepticism. And the order for deposition review isn't an accusation, it's an admission that something in the process went wrong, whether through mismanagement, delay, or conflicting priorities. And for a team already battling internal panic, that kind of inquiry compounds the pressure because federal judges operate outside political theater, dealing in filings, records, and chains of decision-making, and their work doesn't disappear with a tweet or a rally. And this is where Trump's strategy becomes clearer, not in any single statement, but in the pattern of escalation, because whenever scrutiny tightens, the narrative widens, appeals are filed, external threats are emphasized, and the conversation shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation. And it's not subtle, it's instinctive, a reflex honed over decades. Flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes, and hope the audience moves on. But the judiciary isn't an audience, it's a co-equal branch. And some judges are beginning to behave like it again, pressing for subpoenas, following financial trails, and asking why certain avenues weren't pursued proactively if privacy was truly the priority. And again, this isn't about proving an outcome. It's about explaining a process. And processes don't have feelings. They have records. And records are stubborn because they don't care how loudly anyone insists on their own version of events. And the deeper this inquiry goes, the more it threatens to collide with Trump's preferred mode of operation, which is personal control over narrative rather than institutional disclosure. And that collision is what he fears because it limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. And this fear explains why the rhetoric around loyalty has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, and why even neutral oversight is portrayed as partisan warfare. Because once you accept impartial review, you accept the possibility of outcomes you can't control. And Trump has always treated control as synonymous with survival. And this brings us back to why his legal team is so uneasy, because they can see the convergence forming. Deposition mandates being challenged, jurisdictional rulings being scrutinized, disclosure processes being questioned, and internal unity fraying all at once. And they understand that this isn't just a bad news cycle. It's a systems test, one that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top rather than the outside. And some attorneys are now quietly acknowledging that the real risk isn't what investigators might find, but what happens if oversight fails entirely, because a system that can't examine itself becomes brittle, and brittle systems don't bend, they shatter. And this awareness has shifted the internal conversation from defense to distance, from justification to insulation, as counsel calculate how to separate their own professional responsibilities from a client that increasingly treats those responsibilities as obstacles. And all the while, Trump continues to push forward, framing himself as besieged, misunderstood, and unfairly constrained, leaning harder into the language of destiny and personal judgment, even as the institutional machinery around him begins to hum louder, slower, and more deliberately, because oversight doesn't rush. It accumulates. And that accumulation is what keeps him awake, because no matter how many crises are declared or enemies named, paper trails don't vanish, deadlines don't forget, and processes don't care about loyalty. And that's why this moment feels heavier than previous controversies, because it's no longer about what Trump says or tweets. It's about what he can't fully control. And for a leader whose authority has always flowed from dominating the narrative, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force he's faced yet, setting the stage for a final confrontation, not over ideology or elections, but over whether the institutions he navigates are still allowed to navigate him. And this is where the story ultimately lands, not in a single ruling, not in a single phone call, not even in a single deposition order, but in a reckoning that attorneys, judges, and the public alike can no longer postpone. Because what we are watching is not just a clash of personalities or a cycle of outrage, it's a stress test of whether American justice still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office rather than from outside threats. And the reason this moment feels different, heavier, more consequential is that the compulsion is no longer purely adversarial. It's institutional, it's procedural. It's driven by judges who may disagree on ideology, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth. That power justified only by personal will, insulated by appeal language, and defended through intimidation, eventually turns against the very system that grants it legitimacy. And legal teams know this, even if they won't all say it out loud, because they understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents. And once those precedents exist, they don't belong to one man or one family anymore. They belong to whoever comes next. And that realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Rulings issued not for applause, but for restraint. Oversight requests framed not as attacks, but as necessities, and distance created not out of disloyalty, but out of self-preservation, because history is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality. And Trump, for all his bravado, senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, and his reliance on emergency motions more pronounced. Because leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down, they accelerate, they raise the stakes, they demand loyalty tests, and they insist that only they can protect the narrative from collapse, even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. And that paradox is at the center of this presidency's ongoing act. A leader obsessed with legacy but increasingly boxed in by process. A team torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival. And institutions forced to choose whether they will be performative or functional when it matters most. And for the audience watching this unfold, the temptation is to treat it as just another chapter in a long-running political drama. But that would miss the point entirely, because the real question isn't whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern accountability are still stronger than the people who temporarily evade it. And that question doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters, to citizens, to anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. And as this confirmation continues, as oversight grinds forward, and as legal narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands. Not in theory, but in practice. Because systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested, and normalized until someone finally says no. And right now, that no is coming not from the outside, but from within, from judges who understand that compelling a figure from going too far is not overreach, it's responsibility. And whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency, but the rules every future leader inherits, which is why this moment matters so much, why it deserves attention beyond outrage, and why it demands engagement, scrutiny, and conversation. Because justice doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky. And that defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines. One that will be written not by declarations or threats, but by the choices made when power meets its limits. And the world is watching to see whether those limits still mean